Gemar Chatima Tova. May each of you be inscribed in the book of good deeds. For those able, I want to wish you a tzom kal, an easy and meaningful fast. A few weeks ago, I stumbled upon the first video we made of our Shabbat services at the beginning of the pandemic. It was March 20, 2020, and we knew almost nothing about COVID-19. Rabbi Bernstein, Heidi, and I stood as close together as we usually did. Andy, Gabriel, and Sebastian Mayer added their beautiful music. But what struck me, and I mean really gave me anxiety as I watched, was how many COVID safety mistakes we made. None of us had been tested, none of us were distanced, and no one, in front or behind the camera, was in a mask. I couldn't help looking at the footage and noticing all of our imperfections. The truth is, I'm not the first, nor will I be the last rabbi to stand on this bima and remind you that none of us are perfect. Each of us has imperfections, and at its core, the High Holy Day season is about acknowledging our mistakes, apologizing to those whom we have hurt, and vowing to grow from our imperfections. Or, as I offered a few years ago, how we can fail better next time. Our Jewish tradition teaches that we should strive for perfection in the right settings. Gomel chasadim tovim, we pray in the Avot v'Imahot. Yet you offer us kindness and bring redemption to their children's children. This idea of redemption is meant to remind us that as broken as it sometimes appears, the world is ultimately perfectible. God's teachings, carried out by us, will help the world achieve such perfection. In other words, our work in Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, is in hopes of the perfection of our world. In the words of Jewish literary pioneer Ruth Bryn, to love God is to love the world God created and to work to perfect it. Indeed, even the word shalom, which we often translate as peace, can also be translated as a perfect wholeness. Try as we might, we know we will miss the mark. As John Bowers noted in his TED Talk on perfection, failure and imperfection are basically the same thing. We all know that imperfection exists all around us. Nothing and nobody is perfect. And for millennia, rabbis, cantors, and educators have offered us tools to reflect and work on our own imperfections. But what about the imperfections of others? Unfortunately, we don't often allow the space for others to slip up, to be imperfect. And I will admit, I am guilty of this sin as well. Do we really have the patience for others to miss the mark? When we say we are all imperfect, are we really saying, it's okay for me to be imperfect, but not for you? When we say no one is perfect, why should we assume anyone, even our heroes, and even and especially our Torah role models, should be any different? Take Jacob as an example, especially in his relationship with his brother Esau. Jacob sees his brother go out to hunt, makes a stew, and when Esau returns, Jacob sells the stew to Esau for his birthright. Now, I don't know about your family dynamics, but I don't remember charging my sister for the dinner I made when she came home from soccer practice. Or take King David, who in essence murdered one of his generals because King David was attracted to his wife. The stories and examples of our heroes and role models from Tanakh are unfortunately and painfully bountiful. Yes, each has redeeming traits in other stories. But the question becomes, okay, what do we do with this? How can we respond to the imperfection of others? Our response is, unfortunately, a sometimes natural response called loss aversion. In essence, loss aversion is that we have a strong predisposition towards protecting what we feel is ours. And in this case, we don't want to lose the perception that our leaders, heroes, and models are flawed. When our narrative is challenged, our brains backfire and push back against the new narrative. Surely each of us has seen this play out, especially in recent years. When confronted with imperfections about someone or something that goes against our ideal, we push back, dig in our heels, and say, "No, that can't be." Another response to another's imperfection is to shut that person out from your world completely. For some, this is the root of cancel culture. The choice to say, "You're imperfect, and therefore you are no longer welcome in our culture." Naturally, there's always more nuance to each situation. Indeed, cancel culture itself is imperfect. Yet this response may also explain why there has been such ardent pushback against the concept of critical race theory. The core idea of critical race theory is that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. In practice, this has meant that students are now being taught that the Founding Fathers, for example, were not as perfect as previous textbooks may have made them out to be. Surely there's no major harm in teaching the myth that George Washington refused to tell a lie about cutting down his father's cherry tree. But surely there is major harm in not also sharing that Washington supported the abolition of slavery, all the while he owned over 100 slaves. Critical race theory brings to light stories of imperfection, shining a spotlight on the imperfections of society. And just like the challenges we all face when we are confronted with our own failures and imperfections, or the difficulties we face when we hold up a mirror to ourselves and really do deep reflection in cheshbon hanefesh, the examination of our society's flaws, well, it can open deep wounds. In a recent Washington Post article, they explored how efforts to address historic disparities or present-day racial harassment in schools can become fodder for a campaign against critical race theory, fueled by white parents' growing conviction that their children are being taught to feel ashamed of their whiteness and of their country. Yet, these parents don't seem to take the same umbrage when confronted with statements made by their own children on Snapchat, where students held a mock slave trade, accompanied with statements like, "All blacks should die," and "Let's start another Holocaust." Should those students be canceled? Of course not. Was the school right in recognizing the shortcomings and failures in their curriculum and doing something about it? Absolutely. If we can say, honestly and sincerely, that no one is perfect, then we should learn to accept the imperfection of others, whether we are examining our society as a whole or individuals who accomplish greatness. Consider Simone Biles. Going into this Olympic Games, she was called the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And she embraced that moniker, even including a bedazzled goat on her uniform. But when she got to Tokyo, her routines were, well, imperfect. And not the kind of imperfect that would deduct 1/10 of a point from her score. She had a case of the twisties, a psychological phenomenon causing a gymnast to lose air awareness while performing twisting elements, and a gymnast's worst nightmare. She withdrew from the team competition and every other individual element except the balance beam. She prioritized her mental health while acknowledging and embracing how that made her physical abilities imperfect. Unfortunately, many took to various bullhorns, decrying Biles as a quitter and blaming her for being, well, imperfect. What makes Simone Biles a true goat is that she worked through her imperfections and ended up earning the bronze medal for the beam, which she called her most meaningful one. Not the 4 Olympic and 19 World Championship golds. This bronze, because it symbolized her focus on mental health and her perseverance. Of course, just because we accept another's imperfections, it does not mean that their imperfections are without consequence. For truck drivers, pilots, and others in command of heavy machinery, a 99.9% perfection score still means that someone could get seriously hurt or die. And "I'm perfect" is not a good enough excuse. Similarly, someone who consistently expresses hurtful biases without an acknowledgement of those biases nor a willingness to change must also deal with those consequences. So I'd like to suggest 2 ways of responding to the imperfection of others. 1, tochecha, a gentle way of telling someone they have made a mistake and have caused hurt. This constructive criticism comes from a place of compassion, both for the person who was hurt as well as empathy for the person to whom you are offering tochecha, who deserves the benefit of the doubt. 2, positive follow-up. Once failures are identified, there's no need to remind someone of their past. And encouragement goes a long way. Throughout our High Holy Day season, Rabbi Navarez, Rabbi Bernstein, and I have used this teaching from Pirkei Avot. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? If we can give ourselves the space to be imperfect, surely we should allow those whom we love and those whom we look up to that same opportunity. If we cannot help those who are imperfectly human, then we too have missed the mark. And there is no better time to embody that chesed, that compassion, than on this day, Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak of Lublin is quoted as saying, "What is meant by a tzaddik, a righteous person? Not perfection, but the striving to do good. For everyone sins, and perfectionism is not possible for any mortal." There are plenty of resources available where you can reflect and learn to embrace your own imperfections, from books to TED Talks. But if we are going to learn to be okay with our imperfect selves, and yes, that is a work in progress, we should also be okay to accept and embrace the imperfection of others. This concept was perfectly illustrated in the Netflix show, Never Have I Ever, which follows the life of a high schooler, Devi Vishwakumar, whose father tragically has a heart attack. As Devi processes her grief, she often communicates with her father in different ways. During this most recent season, Devi calms herself by repeatedly playing the last voicemail she has from her father, where he ends the message, "My perfect girl." Throughout the season, her desire to live up to her perceived expectation of perfection challenges her, and, naturally for a TV show, gets her into some trouble. But eventually, Devi talks with her father in a dream and confronts him, saying, "I'm so far from perfect. I keep messing up." "I know," he responds. "Some of your recent decisions have been totally wacko. I call you my perfect girl because you are perfect to me, not because I expect you to be perfect all the time." We know that we cannot control what happens to us. But we also know that we can control our response. This year, perhaps we can embrace the imperfection of others, viewing them first with compassion and chesed. May we heed the prayer of Martin Buber. Help me perfect my ways of loving and caring. Inspire me to make myself whole so that I may honor your name and create a world of justice and peace. May 5782 be a year for each of us of striving for perfection, even as we embrace our own and each other's imperfections. Chatima Tova.